The rain is falling on the Aberdeen coast, a soft, persistent drizzle that veils the Scottish castle in a mist the color of pearl. Inside, the air is thick with the scent of old stone and beeswax, and the hushed, frantic footsteps of courtiers. A nurse stands by a bed, her gaze fixed on the frail figure beneath the blankets, a woman whose hand has held the scepter of an empire for longer than most of her subjects have been alive. But it is not the queen they are watching, it is her daughter. Elizabeth, the Princess Royal, is on her knees beside her mother, not in a curtsy, but in the raw, private act of a child saying goodbye. She is not here as a royal, she is here as Anne, the daughter. The clock on the mantel reads 15:09 on a September afternoon. At this exact moment, the life of the mother ends and the future of the House of Windsor, a dynasty forged in war, tested by scandal and bound by duty, tilts on its axis. This is not just the story of a family. It is the story of a contract between a crown and a country, written in blood, ink, and the silent language of the heart. If the quiet corridors of history and the clamor of the modern world call to you, then subscribe and walk with us through the gilded halls of the past. Chapter 1: The Name in the Fire. The smoke from a million chimneys hung over London like a shroud. It was the spring of 1917, and the city was a place of muffled drums and unspoken fear. The light, what little of it pierced the gray canopy of coal smoke and rain clouds, fell weakly upon the walls of Buckingham Palace, making the stone seem porous, as if it too were sweating with anxiety. Inside, the atmosphere was even heavier. It was the particular, suffocating weight of dread. For King George V, the world he had inherited was not just changing. It was being torn apart by artillery shells and buried in the mud of passion. The stench of that distant mud, carried on the clothes of wounded officers granted audiences, seemed to cling to the velvet curtains and Persian rugs of the palace, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. The king was a man carved from nautical oak, stubborn, blunt, and deeply conservative. He was more comfortable in the brisk salt air of a naval bridge than in the gilded cages of state. But in these months, he found himself a sailor without a compass, his ship caught in a hurricane of history. His first cousin, Tsar Nicholas II, had been forced to abdicate just months earlier. The Romanov dynasty, an autocracy that had ruled for 300 years, swept away by revolution as if it were so much dust. The news had slithered across the royal courts of Europe like a black serpent. If it could happen to the Tsar, it could happen to any of them. George's own face, so similar to Nicholas's that they could be mistaken for twins, stared back at him from newspapers above captions that grew more hostile by the week. The British public, enduring the hell of the Somme and the relentless U-boat attacks, had turned their rage onto anything German, and the royal family, by blood and name, was German. The name was Saxe-Coburg-Gotha. It clung to them, a label of the enemy. In the music halls, comics would roll the name around their mouths like a sour lozenge, drawing sneers and hisses from the crowds. The popular press, led by the thunderous broadsides of the Daily Mail, launched a sustained attack. They pointed out with venomous accuracy that the king was the grandson of Queen Victoria and her beloved German Prince Albert. They listed the king's German cousins, his German dukedoms, his German relatives in the German army. The fact that George V had publicly repudiated his cousin the Kaiser, that British soldiers were dying to stop German militarism, seemed not to matter. The family name was a taunt, a weapon used against the crown. We can imagine the king in his study, the room lit by the jaundiced glow of a gas lamp. On his desk lay a folder, its contents a dossier of hate mail and clippings. One of them, from the satirical magazine Punch, depicted a beleaguered British lion saddled with a baggage labeled German Connection. It was meant to be funny, but the humor was a thin veneer over a profound threat. The king's private secretary, the ever-loyal Lord Stamford, watched his master brood. Stamfordham was the keeper of the king's conscience and the architect of his public image. He understood, with a clarity that bordered on clairvoyance, that this was not a matter of public relations spin. This was a matter of survival. The decision, when it came, was not born of inspiration but of desperation. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that the magic of monarchy could be repackaged and sold under a new label. The king's mind, practical and straightforward, latched onto an idea. They would not just change a title, they would cut the historical moorings and create a new identity, one so British it could not be questioned. They would choose a name that evoked the very essence of England, a name that resonated with the misty hills and ancient stones of the island they sought to embody. They would become the House of Windsor. But the path to that simple declaration was littered with anxiety and the ghosts of the past. The family archives at Windsor Castle were delved into. Secretaries and historians were tasked with finding a precedent, any precedent, for a royal house changing its name. They found none. This was an act of radical reinvention disguised as tradition. The king himself pored over lists of suggestions. There was talk of reviving the old Saxon titles, of calling the dynasty Plantagenet or Tudor. But those names carried their own baggage of blood and civil war. Others suggested England or Britain, but that felt too naked, too republican in its simplicity. It was the king's own librarian who, leafing through a medieval chronicle, came upon a reference to Windsor. It was perfect. Windsor Castle had been the home of British monarchs for 900 years, a fortress built by William the Conqueror that had weathered every storm. It was a name of stone and permanence, not of blood and politics. It was a name that said, "We are of this land." The emotional cost of this decision, however, was buried beneath the official language of the proclamation. It was, in a very real sense, a disowning. It was a severing of the umbilical cord that tied George VIII to his ancestor, to the vast, interconnected web of European royalty that had, for centuries, considered itself a single family above the fray of mere nations. To change the name was to admit that this old world was dead, killed by the machine guns of the 20th century. It was to choose the nation over the family. When the king signed the order in council on July 17, 1917, he was not just signing a document, he was signing away a part of himself. He also renounced, on behalf of all his family, every German title and style. Battenberg became Mountbatten. Tech became Cambridge. The family tree was pruned of its German branches with ruthless efficiency. And yet, as the ink dried, there was a palpable sense of relief. The name was a shield. It was a declaration of solidarity. In the streets of London, the news was met with approval. It was a small thing, a symbolic gesture, but in a war of symbols it mattered. It told the grieving mother in Bethnal Green, who had lost her son on the Western Front, that her king shared her enemy. It was a lie, of course, a political and historical lie, but it was a necessary lie, a comforting lie. The House of Windsor was born not in a blaze of glory, but in the cold, pragmatic light of a world at war, a fortress built against the rising tide of revolution. The question that hung in the smoke-filled air, unasked and unanswered, was simple. Would the fortress hold? We move deeper into the year, and the true test of the new name begins. It is one thing to proclaim a new identity from the safety of the palace. It is another to have it accepted in the factories, the shipyards, and the trenches. The king, ever a man of action, understood that the name change had to be followed by a change in behavior. The monarchy had to be seen, not just read about. It had to share in the nation's sacrifice. This was a radical departure from the aloof, ceremonially distant monarchy of the 19th century. We can picture the scene at Buckingham Palace on a crisp autumn morning. King George VIII, in the uniform of an admiral of the fleet, strides out to the courtyard where his motorcar waits. But these are not the stately, slow drives of peacetime. This is a purposeful, almost frantic schedule of engagement. The king and his trusted advisor, Stamford, have plotted a course through the industrial heartlands of England and Wales. They will visit munitions factories where women, their faces streaked with cordite, work 16-hour shifts. They will walk through the vast, echoing sheds of shipyards on the Clyde, where the din of riveting is deafening. They will tour the coal mines of South Wales, emerging from the pit heads with coal dust on their faces, a shocking, intimate image of shared toil. The sensory experience of these tours is overwhelming. For the king, a man accustomed to the quiet order of the palace, the factories are a cacophony of sound and a kaleidoscope of smells. Hot metal, oil, sweat, and the sharp, acrid tang of explosives. The workers, in turn, experience a sensory overload of their own. Here, standing before them, is not a distant figure in a golden coach, but a man in a uniform, a man who looks tired, a man whose eyes hold the same anxiety they feel. The newsreel cameras are there, their bulky presence a new kind of magic. They crank away, capturing these moments of contact, and within days, these flickering images are being shown in cinemas across the country. The people see their king in the factories, and they see themselves, reflected in his gaze, as part of the national story. But there is a darker side to this visibility, a side that the architects of the new Windsor brand understood implicitly. Visibility is a double-edged sword. It invites adulation, but it also invites scrutiny. And in the midst of war, that scrutiny could be merciless. The king's cousin, the Tsar, had been visible in all the wrong ways, isolated, remote, seemingly indifferent to the suffering of his people. George V was determined not to repeat that mistake. Yet, the memory of Nicholas haunted him. In the spring of 1917, the British government had offered the Tsar and his family asylum. The king, after initial hesitation, had withdrawn the offer, fearing that the presence of the deposed, hated autocrat on British soil would inflame Republican sentiment and taint his own carefully crafted image as a people's king. It was a decision that has echoed through history with a terrible, tragic resonance. The Tsar and his family were sent to Ekaterinburg, where, in the summer of 1918, they were herded into a basement and executed by firing squad. The bullets that killed the Romanovs were heard in every royal palace in Europe. For George V, they were a personal and political thunderclap. The murder of his cousins was not just a family tragedy. It was a warning, written in blood, of the fate that awaited dynasties that failed to adapt. The war ended in 1918, but the peace brought no respite. The world had changed. The old certainties of class and deference were crumbling. Men returned from the trenches with a new, bitter understanding of the value of life and the cost of leadership. They had seen their officers die alongside them. They were no longer willing to touch their forelocks to the squire. The Labour Party was rising, trade unions were flexing their muscles, and the specter of Bolshevism haunted the drawing rooms of the elite. In this new, fractured landscape, the House of Windsor had to find a new purpose. It could no longer rule, it could only serve. It could no longer command respect, it had to earn it. The king turned to a new kind of ritual. He embraced the radio, the wireless, which was beginning to appear in homes across the country. On Christmas Day, 1932, he sat before a microphone in a small room at Sandringham, his voice, gruff, hesitant, but unmistakably human, crackling across the airwaves. He spoke of peace, of family, of hope for the coming year. He was not speaking to a crowd, but to individuals sitting in their parlors, their kitchens, their cottages. It was an act of extraordinary intimacy, a technological miracle that allowed the monarch to enter the private spaces of his subjects. It was a perfect metaphor for the new monarchy, a voice without a body, a presence that was both everywhere and nowhere. The nation listened, and for a few minutes, the divisions of class and politics seemed to dissolve in the shared act of listening to the king. This was the foundation upon which the modern House of Windsor was built. It was a foundation of pragmatism, of sacrifice, and of a calculated intimacy. George V had navigated the ship of state through the most dangerous waters any modern monarchy had faced. He had changed its name, changed its course, and secured its immediate future. But as his own health began to fail, as the strain of a lifetime of duty etched deep lines into his face, he must have looked upon his heirs with a mixture of hope and profound unease. The fortress of Windsor had been reinforced, but the walls had only been tested by the storms outside. The question now was whether they could withstand the storms within. The twilight of George V's reign was a slow, melancholic fade. The nation, still grieving its war dead and grappling with economic depression, looked to the monarchy as a symbol of stability, a fixed point in a world spinning off its axis. The king, now visibly aged and plagued by the lung ailments that a lifetime of heavy smoking had wrought, became a symbol of that endurance. His silver jubilee in 1935 was an explosion of genuine, heartfelt affection that surprised even the palace. The streets were festooned with bunting, and crowds gathered for hours just to catch a glimpse of the king and his queen, Mary. It was a collective act of thanksgiving, a moment when a weary nation thanked its weary king for simply being there. The old sailor, who had never sought popularity, was genuinely moved. "I'd no idea they felt like that about me," he is said to have remarked, the gruff exterior cracking to reveal a depth of feeling he rarely showed. The warmth of that summer, the roar of the crowds, the sea of smiling faces, it was a sensory balm, a final, golden afternoon before the long, cold night. But the king knew the end was near. By January 1936, he was bedridden at Sandringham, the Norfolk house he loved more than any palace. The room was quiet, save for the crackle of the fire and the labored breathing of the dying man. His physician, Lord Dawson of Penn, administered morphine and cocaine to ease the final hours, a practice not uncommon at the time. The king's family gathered, their faces drawn with grief. His eldest son, David, the Prince of Wales, was there, his charismatic presence filling the room with a restless energy that seemed out of place in the presence of death. The king drifted in and out of consciousness. Outside, a small crowd of journalists and well-wishers huddled in the freezing cold, waiting for news. The world held its breath. At 5 minutes to midnight on January 20, 1936, George V died. But the story of his passing is not just a story of death. It is a story of how the House of Windsor managed the truth, even at the most sacred of moments. Lord Dawson, concerned that the news would break first in the less reputable evening papers rather than the dignified morning broadsheets, took action. He later wrote that he felt it was his duty to ease the passing in such a way that the official announcement could be made in the Times and the morning paper. With the king already in a deep, unconscious state, Dawson injected him with a lethal dose of morphine and cocaine. The king's death was thus hastened to suit the convenience of the press. The official announcement came at 9:25 the following morning. Death came peacefully to the king at 11:55 last night. The lie, a small, clinical act of manipulation, was a stark reminder that the management of the royal image was now paramount. The family's grief was real, but it was secondary to the needs of the institution. The nation mourned a king who had, in his final moments, been transformed from a man into a carefully timed headline. The new king, Edward VIII, walked behind his father's coffin through the snow-covered streets of London. The crowds were silent, their breath misting in the icy air. It was a scene of haunting, black-and-white beauty, a final, formal farewell to the old world. But as Edward walked, his eyes were not on the coffin of his father, but on the crowds, searching for a face that was not there. His mind was not on the weight of the crown he had just inherited, but on a woman waiting in a house in Mayfair, a woman named Wallis Simpson. The storm that would shake the House of Windsor to its very foundations was not gathering on the battlefields of Europe, but in the heart of its new king. The reign of Edward VIII lasted less than a year. It was a reign of contradiction, a blur of progressive gestures and personal obsession. He toured the deprived areas of South Wales, famously declaring, "Something must be done," a phrase that alarmed his conservative ministers but endeared him to the unemployed. He seemed modern, approachable, a king for a new age. But this modernity was a veneer. At its core, his kingship was consumed by his relationship with Wallis Simpson, an American divorcee. In the eyes of the government, the Church of England, of which the king was the supreme governor, and the establishment, a divorced woman whose previous marriages had not been dissolved by the church could never become queen. The choice was clear: give her up or give up the throne. The abdication crisis of 1936 was a seismic event. It was played out not in the hushed corridors of power, but in the full glare of the world's media, which had descended on London like a flock of vultures. The wireless crackled with speculation. Newspapers were devoured. The royal family, so carefully constructed as a symbol of duty and family values, was revealed to be deeply, humanly fallible. For the new shy Duke of York, the man they called Bertie, the crisis was a personal torture. He had never wanted to be king. He was plagued by a stammer that made public speaking an agony. He was a family man, content in the shadows. Now his brother's choice was forcing him, a reluctant, terrified man, into the blinding light. We can feel the tension in the room at Fort Belvedere where Edward signed the instrument of abdication, the scratch of the pen on paper, the quiet sobs of his brothers, the cold finality of it all. As Edward, now the Duke of Windsor, left for exile, he turned to his younger brother and gave a deep, formal bow. It was the bow of a subject to his sovereign. Bertie, now King George VI, watched his brother walk away, the weight of a crown he had never sought settling onto his brow like a crown of thorn. The House of Windsor had survived its first great internal crisis, but the cost was incalculable. The man who had been the popular, modern hope was gone. In his place stood a man who had to be taught how to be king, a man whose every public word was a battle against his own voice. The fortress still stood, but its walls had been breached by the one thing no name change could ever protect against: the human heart. The question now was whether this reluctant king could rebuild the trust his brother had shattered, and whether his quiet courage could speak louder than his brother's charismatic silence. Chapter 2: The Man Who Wasn't There. The silence that followed the abdication was not an empty silence. It was a silence filled with ghosts. In the gilded state rooms of Buckingham Palace, the chandeliers were draped in dust cloths. The great mirrors turned to face the walls as if in mourning. But the mourning was not for the brother who had left. It was for the life that the new king and queen would never have. For Elizabeth, the Duchess of York, the moment her brother-in-law signed that instrument of abdication, her world contracted. She had married a prince, not a king. She had built a life of happy obscurity, raising her two young daughters, Elizabeth and Margaret, in the comfortable embrace of royal life without its crushing center. Now she watched her husband, a man she loved with a fierce protectiveness, walk towards a precipice. Albert Frederick Arthur George, Bertie to his family, had spent his entire life in the shadow of his elder brother. David, as Edward was known within the family, was everything Bertie was not. David was tall, handsome, effortlessly charming, a man who seemed to glide through life on a current of adoration. Bertie was shy, prone to debilitating bouts of anxiety, and plagued by a stammer that turned the simple act of speaking into a public ordeal. Their father, George V, had often been impatient with Bertie's nervous disposition, once famously snapping at him, "Just get it out, boy." The contrast between the two brothers was a constant, low-level hum in the background of Bertie's consciousness, a reminder of his own perceived inadequacy. And now, because of David's choices, all of Bertie's fears had been made manifest. He was no longer the second son, the spare heir who could fade into the comfort of family life. He was the king. We can imagine the scene at 145 Piccadilly, the London home of the Yorks, in the days following the abdication. The telephone rang constantly, a shrill, insistent sound that seemed to pierce the very marrow of the house. It was the palace, the Prime Minister's office, the Archbishop of Canterbury. Each call carried another weight, another decision, another reminder of the terrible new reality. Elizabeth, the new queen consort, moved through the house with a determined grace, answering the calls, shielding her husband from the worst of the storm, but she could not shield him from the truth. One evening she found him in the nursery, standing over the cot of their eldest daughter, the little girl they called Lilibet. He was just staring at her, his face a mask of anguish. He knew that this child, this innocent sleeping face, was now heir to the throne. He knew that the life he had wanted for her, a life of relative privacy and happiness, had been stolen, just as his had been. The weight of that knowledge was a physical thing, a crushing pressure in his chest. The coronation was set for May 12, 1937, the very date that had been chosen for Edward's coronation. It was a deliberate act of continuity, a signal to the world and to the nation that the institution of monarchy was larger than any one man. But for Bertie, it was a performance he dreaded. The entire ritual was a gauntlet of public speaking, of being the focal point of a million eyes. He had to rehearse every moment, every movement, every word. The new queen was his rock, her calm presence a counterweight to his anxiety, but even she could not help him with his stammer. For that, he turned to an unlikely figure, an Australian speech therapist named Lionel Logg. The relationship between the king and the commoner was one of the most improbable and profound in royal history. Their first meeting, in Logg's modest consulting room on Harley Street, was a collision of two worlds. The king, stiff with formality and embarrassment, stood awkwardly as Logg, a man utterly unimpressed by titles, invited him to sit. "Now," Logg said in his direct colonial accent, "what's this little trouble, then?" The king, unaccustomed to such familiarity, was taken aback. But Logg's method was not about deference. It was about trust. He explained that the stammer was not a physical defect, but a psychological one, a knot of fear and self-doubt that had tightened over a lifetime. To loosen that knot, the king would have to be vulnerable, something he had never been allowed to be. The sensory details of these sessions are intimate and revealing. The small, wood-paneled room, the scratch of Logg's fountain pen as he took notes, the king's voice, straining against its own limitations, spitting out words in fragments. Logg would have him read passages from Shakespeare, from the Bible, from the day's newspaper, while listening to classical music on a gramophone to drown out his own voice. The theory was that if the king could not hear himself, the fear would subside and the words would flow. And sometimes, miraculously, they did. In that small room, away from the gilded cages of the palace, Bertie was not the king. He was just a man, struggling, sweating, swearing with frustration, and slowly, painfully, learning to speak. But the sessions were about more than mechanics. They were about unlocking the man within. Log would ask him about his childhood, about his father, about his brother. The king spoke of the cruel nanny who had preferred David, who would pinch Bertie before meals so that he would cry and be sent away from the table, leaving David to dine with their parents. He spoke of the constant comparisons, the feeling of never being enough. The stammer, Log realized, was the voice of that hurt child, a physical manifestation of a lifetime of suppressed anger and sorrow. By acknowledging that pain, by giving it a voice in the safety of that room, the king began to loosen its grip on him. It was a form of psychological excavation, a digging through the rubble of his past to find the foundations of his future. The day of the coronation arrived, gray and drizzly. The king woke early, the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. He dressed in the heavy robes of state, the weight of the ermine and velvet a physical reminder of the burden he carried. The gold coach rumbled through the streets of London, the crowds a blur of faces through the rain-streaked windows. He could hear the cheers, but they seemed distant, muffled, as if they were meant for someone else. Inside Westminster Abbey, the air was thick with incense and the murmured prayers of 1,000 dignitaries. The light filtered through the stained-glass windows, casting pools of color onto the ancient stone floor. As he walked towards the altar, his legs felt weak, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to speak. He had to make the declarations, to recite the oaths. And he was terrified. But then something shifted. Perhaps it was the presence of his wife, her eyes fixed on him with unwavering love. Perhaps it was the memory of Log's voice, calm and steady in his ear. "You can do this, Bertie." Perhaps it was the sheer weight of the moment, the sense that this was bigger than his fear. He opened his mouth and the words came. They were slow, measured, carefully placed, but they came. He spoke the oath of sovereignty, his voice clear and resonant in the vast space. It was not a flawless performance. There were pauses, hesitations, but it was a triumph of will over fear. As the crown of St. Edward was placed upon his head and the congregation cried, "God save the King," a wave of relief washed over him. He had done it. He had faced his greatest fear, and he had not been destroyed. The coronation was a beginning, but the true test was yet to come. Across the English Channel, the clouds of war were gathering once more. Adolf Hitler, a man who understood the power of spectacle and the weakness of democracies, watched the new king with a calculating eye. He saw George VI as a weak link, a stammering monarch presiding over a divided and uncertain empire. The Nazis hoped in the early years for an accommodation with Britain, even a revival of the old ties that had bound the Windsors to Germany. They held a card they believed was a trump, the Duke of Windsor, now exiled in Paris and later living in fascist Portugal. The shadow of the man who wasn't there stretched across the opening years of the war. The Duke and Duchess of Windsor, bitter and resentful, were a gift to Nazi propaganda. They were courted by German agents, who hoped to use the Duke as a figurehead for a peace faction, or even to restore him to the throne as a puppet king under Nazi influence. The British government, terrified of this possibility, acted with ruthless efficiency. They dispatched Winston Churchill himself to apply pressure, and eventually they appointed the Duke to the governorship of the Bahamas, effectively exiling him to a remote outpost in the Caribbean, far from the centers of power. For George VI, this was a constant, low-level humiliation. His brother, the man who had abandoned his duty, was now a potential security threat, a loose cannon that had to be watched and contained. The family wound festered, hidden from public view but poisoning the well of royal relations. Meanwhile in Britain, the war became the crucible in which George VI's kingship was forged. The Blitz began in September 1940, and London was transformed into a landscape of fire and rubble. The king and queen made a decision that would define their reign and endear them to their people forever. They refused to leave London. They remained in Buckingham Palace, a highly visible target for German bombers. When the palace was bombed, twice, the Queen famously declared, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." This was not just a public relations line. It was a genuine expression of solidarity. The bombs that fell on the palace were the same bombs that were falling on the homes of their subjects. The king and queen shared the danger, and in sharing it, they became, in the hearts of the people, not just monarchs but fellow citizens. The sensory experience of the war for the royal family was one of constant, grinding stress. The nights were punctuated by the wail of air raid sirens, the distant crump of explosions, the eerie whistle of falling bombs. They would descend to the makeshift shelter in the palace basement, a cramped, uncomfortable space where they tried to maintain a semblance of normal life. The king would study his maps and military reports by the light of a single bulb. The queen would knit. The young princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, would play games or listen to stories read by their governess. Above them, the city burned. But in that shelter, the family was drawn together in a way that peacetime had never allowed. The distance between the crown and the people, so carefully maintained for centuries, was bridged by the simple, terrible reality of shared danger. The king's role in the war was not just symbolic, it was deeply personal. He visited the bombed-out streets of the East End, walking through the rubble, talking to the rescue workers, comforting the bereaved. He toured factories, shipyards, and military installations, his quiet, determined presence a source of quiet inspiration. He insisted on wearing his Admiral of the Fleet uniform, not as a costume, but as a sign that he was part of the war effort. And he spoke to the nation, his voice, still hesitant but now imbued with a new authority, crackling across the airwaves. His Christmas broadcasts became a national ritual, a moment of shared reflection in a world gone mad. The man who could barely speak in public had become the voice of a nation's resolve. But perhaps his most important role was as a confidant and support to Winston Churchill. The relationship between the king and his prime minister was one of mutual respect and deep affection. They met weekly, often over lunch, to discuss the progress of the war. The king, with his naval background and his meticulous attention to detail, was not a passive listener. He questioned, he probed, he offered his own insights. Churchill, in turn, valued the king's steady presence, his unwavering commitment to the fight. In the darkest days of the war, when Britain stood alone against the Nazi tide, these two men, the lion and the reluctant king, formed a bond that was essential to the nation's survival. They were the twin pillars upon which the British spirit rested. The war ended in 1945, and the victory was in part a victory for the House of Windsor. The king and his family had become synonymous with the national struggle. On VE Day, the royal family appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, waving to the ecstatic crowds below. The king, in his uniform, stood with his queen and his daughters. The roar that went up from the crowd was deafening, a tidal wave of joy and relief. But as the king looked out at the sea of faces, he must have felt a profound weariness. The war had aged him beyond his years. The strain of a decade of crisis, the abdication, the stammer, the war, had taken a physical toll. He was only 50 years old, but he looked and felt much older. The smoke from the victory bonfires drifted across London, carrying with it the scent of hope, but also the cold whisper of a future that was uncertain. The man who wasn't there was still a ghost in the background, a reminder of the fragility of the dynasty. The question now was whether the king's body, worn down by a lifetime of duty, could sustain the peace as bravely as it had sustained the war. The post-war years brought a new set of challenges, quieter but no less demanding. The British Empire, the largest the world had ever seen, was dissolving. India, the jewel in the crown, was granted independence in 1947. The king lost the title of Emperor of India, a symbolic blow that marked the end of an era. He watched as the map of the world was redrawn, the pink patches of imperial control shrinking with each passing year. This was not a process he could stop, only witness. It was a lesson in the diminishing power of monarchy, a reminder that the Windsors now ruled over a commonwealth of nations, not an empire. The adjustment was painful, a slow, dignified retreat from global dominance. Yet even in this period of national contraction, the royal family found a new source of hope and optimism: the next generation. Princess Elizabeth, now a young woman of striking composure and grace, was being groomed for her future role. In 1947, she married her distant cousin, Philip Mountbatten, a handsome, charismatic naval officer of Greek and Danish descent. The wedding was a splash of color in the gray austerity of post-war Britain, a fairy tale that captured the imagination of the world. The king gave his daughter away with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He knew that this marriage, while a source of joy, was also a step towards his own obsolescence. The torch was being passed, slowly but surely, to the next generation. Philip, however, brought his own complications. He was a man of strong opinion, a modernizer who chafed against the stuffy traditions of the court. Before the marriage, he had renounced his foreign titles and converted to Anglicanism, taking the surname Mountbatten, the anglicized version of his mother's family name, Battenberg. But the name Mountbatten was a source of tension. The king and the queen mother especially were insistent that the royal house would remain Windsor, and that Elizabeth's children would be Windsors, not Mountbatten. It was a bureaucratic battle, a war of names, but it was also a battle for the soul of the dynasty. Would the family continue as the House of Windsor, the name forged in the fire of the Great War, or would it absorb the new, more cosmopolitan blood of the Mountbattens? The king, ever the traditionalist, stood firm. In 1952, he issued a declaration that the royal house would remain Windsor, a decision that caused a rift with Philip that would simmer for years. Meanwhile, the king's health was deteriorating. He had been a heavy smoker for most of his life, a habit that had left his lungs weakened. He began to suffer from circulatory problems, and in 1951, he underwent a major lung operation, during which his left lung was removed. The recovery was slow and painful. He was forced to cancel a planned tour of Australia and New Zealand, a tour that was instead undertaken by his daughter and son-in-law. It was on that tour in February 1952 that the final blow fell. The king, feeling better than he had in months, spent a day shooting at Sandringham. He retired early, content, and tired. The next morning, February 6, he was found dead in his bed by his valet. He had died in his sleep from a coronary thrombosis. He was 56 years old. The news reached Princess Elizabeth at a remote hunting lodge in Kenya, Treetops, where she and Philip were staying. She had climbed a tree as a princess. She descended as a queen. The moment was captured in the memory of those present. The stunned silence, the dawning realization, the weight of the world descending upon the shoulders of a 25-year-old woman. She immediately returned to London, where she was greeted at the airport by a grieving Winston Churchill. The sight of the young queen, dressed in black, stepping off the plane, was an image that seared itself into the national consciousness. The reign of George VI was over. The reign of Elizabeth II had begun. The funeral of George VI was a moment of profound national mourning. The man who had never wanted to be king had become, in the eyes of his people, a symbol of quiet heroism. He had faced his demons, had overcome his stammer, had led his nation through its darkest hour, and had died as his father had, worn out by the burden of duty. The procession wound its way through the streets of London, the crowd silent and respectful. The new queen, her face pale and set, walked behind her father's coffin, just as he had walked behind his father's 16 years earlier. The cycle of death and succession, the relentless rhythm of the monarchy, continued. But as the coffin was lowered into the vault at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, another figure stood in the shadows, watching from afar. The Duke of Windsor, the man who wasn't there, was not invited to the funeral of his own brother. He was still in exile, still a ghost, a living reminder of the crisis that had nearly destroyed the House of Windsor. His absence was as powerful as any presence. It spoke of a wound that had never healed, a family torn apart by choice and duty. The new queen, Elizabeth II, now carried the weight of that family history, the good and the bad, the courage and the cowardice. She had inherited a throne, but she had also inherited a legacy of shadow. The question that hung in the cold February air was simple. What kind of queen would she be? Would she be her father's daughter, a monarch of quiet duty? Or would the ghosts of the past find new ways to haunt the House of Windsor? The answer lay in the future, a future she now had to build, alone, with the weight of a crown upon her head and the memory of a father's love in her heart. Chapter 3. The House of the Rising Sun. The world into which Elizabeth II was crowned was one of stark black and white slowly bleeding into color. The newsreels of the early 1950s flickered with images of a nation still mending itself, still living with ration books and bomb sites. But there was a new energy in the air, a desperate hunger for something bright, something hopeful. And on June 2, 1953, that hope was coronated. The decision to allow television cameras into Westminster Abbey was a gamble, a radical departure from centuries of tradition. The Archbishop of Canterbury, among others, feared that the intrusion of technology would strip the ceremony of its mystery, reducing a sacred ritual to mere entertainment. But the young queen, advised by a new breed of courtiers who understood the power of the moving image, overruled them. She understood, perhaps intuitively, that if the monarchy was to survive in the modern age, it had to be seen, not just imagined. The sensory experience of that day was unlike anything the world had ever witnessed. For the millions huddled around their small, flickering television sets, many of them renting the sets specially for the occasion, their screens no larger than a sheet of paper, the coronation was a revelation. The grainy, black and white images transported them into the sacred space of the abbey. They saw the shimmer of silk and cloth of gold. They saw the peeresses in their velvet robes and diamond tiaras, a constellation of wealth and privilege. They saw the ancient ritual of the anointing, the moment when the young queen, divested of her regal trappings and seated in the coronation chair beneath a canopy of gold, was touched with holy oil, transformed from a woman into a sacred being. It was an act of profound intimacy, witnessed by a nation. For the first time, the mystique of monarchy was broadcast into the living rooms of the common people, and instead of diminishing the magic, it seemed to amplify it. But for the central figure in this drama, the 27-year-old woman at the heart of it all, the day was a blur of sensory overload. The weight of St. Edward's crown, solid gold and encrusted with jewels, was immense, nearly 5 pounds pressing down upon her brow. The heavy robes, the ancient scepters in her hands, the heat of the abbey, the droning liturgy, the sea of faces. It was a physical ordeal as much as a spiritual one. She had been preparing for this moment her entire life, ever since that day at 145 Piccadilly when her father had become king. But preparation could not fully arm her for the sheer, crushing reality of it. As she emerged from the abbey into the grey London light, the roar of the crowd hit her like a wave. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated joy, a collective sigh of relief and hope. She raised her gloved hand in a wave, a gesture that would become as familiar as breathing over the next 70 years. She was no longer just Lilibet, the dutiful daughter. She was the queen. The early years of her reign were a delicate balancing act between continuity and change. On one hand, she was determined to be her father's daughter, to embody the values of duty, service, and family that he had exemplified. She kept his private secretary, the wise and cautious Tommy Lascelles, close at hand, relying on his institutional memory to navigate the treacherous waters of constitutional politics. She maintained the old ritual, the weekly audiences with the prime minister, the endless red boxes of state papers, the precise etiquette of court life. But on the other hand, she was young, and the world was changing around her with breathtaking speed. The empire was dissolving into the Commonwealth, a loose association of nations that she would have to bind together with nothing more than goodwill and the force of her personality. The old certainties of class and deference were crumbling. A new generation, the teenagers of the 1950s, were listening to rock and roll, wearing jeans and questioning authority in ways their parents never would have dared. The Queen's response to this changing world was not to fight it, but to embody a different kind of modernity, a modernity of visibility. She became the most traveled monarch in British history. In the first decade of her reign alone, she undertook an astonishing series of Commonwealth tours, crisscrossing the globe in a relentless schedule of appearances. We can feel the heat of the Australian sun as she walks through the streets of Sydney. The crowds pressed against the barriers, their faces lit with a fervent, almost religious devotion. We can smell the spices of India as she processes through the streets of New Delhi on an elephant, a gesture of respect that wins hearts and minds. We can taste the salt spray of the Atlantic as she stands on the deck of the royal yacht Britannia, waving to the crowds in a tiny island nation in the Caribbean. She was not just a distant figure in a palace. She was a presence, a real person who could be seen, touched, and cheered. These tours were grueling, a physical and emotional marathon. The Queen and Prince Philip would be away from their young children, Charles and Anne, for months at a time, a separation that caused both parents private anguish. The schedule was relentless, wave after wave, handshake after handshake, banquet after banquet. The smile, that famously neutral expression, was a mask, a shield against exhaustion and the constant scrutiny. But it was also a tool, a way of connecting without revealing too much. She learned to project warmth without intimacy, interest without involvement. It was a performance of a lifetime, and she was its star. While the Queen was building her public persona on the world stage, a different drama was unfolding in the private spaces of the monarchy. The marriage to Prince Philip, initially a fairy tale romance, was evolving into a complex partnership of duty and compromise. Philip was a man of restless energy and sharp intellect, trapped in a role that offered no clear purpose. He was the Queen's consort, a position with no constitutional definition, no real job description. He was expected to walk 2 steps behind his wife, to bow to her in public, to subsume his own identity into hers. For a man who had been a dashing naval officer, who had commanded his own ship, this was a form of slow suffocation. We can feel the tension in the private apartments of the palace. The arguments, the slammed doors, the long silences. Philip chafed against the stuffy courtiers, the endless protocol, the sense of being a mere appendage. He pushed for modernization, for a more informal, accessible monarchy. He wanted to bring the family into the 20th century, to shake off the dust of the Victorian age. The Queen, caught between her love for her husband and her profound sense of duty to the institution she embodied, often found herself in the middle. She needed Philip. He was her anchor, her confidant, the only person who treated her as a woman, not a symbol. But she also needed to maintain the dignity of the crown. The tension between these two needs would define their relationship for decades. The children, Charles and Anne, grew up in this strange, pressurized environment. They were loved, certainly, but their parents' love was often expressed from a distance. The Queen, taught from childhood to suppress her emotions, found it difficult to show physical affection. The long separations caused by royal tour created an emotional gap that was hard to bridge. Charles, in particular, was a sensitive, introspective child, utterly unlike his boisterous, confident father. He inherited his mother's shyness and his father's intelligence, but he lacked the armor that both parents had developed. He was a boy who felt things deeply, who loved books and music and the natural world, and he was growing up in a world that valued stoicism and duty above all else. The seeds of future conflict were being sown in the quiet corridors of the palace nursery. Meanwhile, the 1960s were exploding into life. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, the sexual revolution, the rise of youth culture, it all seemed to pass the palace by, a distant noise from a different planet. The monarchy, under the Queen's steady but cautious guidance, seemed frozen in time, a gilded island of tradition in a sea of change. This began to create a disconnect. The younger generation, the very people who would inherit the monarchy, were beginning to see it as an irrelevance, a relic of a bygone age. The adulation of the coronation was fading, replaced by a more skeptical, questioning attitude. The press, always hungry for a story, began to look for cracks in the polished facade. They found one in the person of Princess Margaret, the Queen's younger sister. Margaret was everything the Queen was not: glamorous, rebellious, artistic, and deeply unhappy. Her romance with Group Captain Peter Townsend, a divorced man 16 years her senior, had been a cause célèbre in the 1950s. Forced to choose between her love and her royal status, Margaret had ultimately chosen duty, but the choice had left her bitter and resentful. In the swinging 60s, she became a fixture of the London social scene, photographed at parties, surrounded by a glamorous set of actors, artists, and hangers-on. Her marriage to the photographer Anthony Armstrong-Jones, later Lord Snowdon, was a modern fairy tale that quickly soured into a very public, very messy disintegration. Margaret was a warning, a living example of what happened when the constraints of royal life clashed with the desires of the human heart. She was the ghost of the abdication, reincarnated for a new generation. The Queen watched her sister's trajectory with a mixture of love and helplessness. She could not control Margaret. She could only watch as the tabloids feasted on her misery. The image of the royal family as a perfect, untroubled unit was beginning to show its first real cracks. The public, once content with the distant, dignified image of the crown, was now hungry for the human drama behind the scenes. And the palace, still run by courtiers who believed that silence was the only defense, had no idea how to manage this new, intrusive world. They continued to operate as if the old rules still applied, as if deference and distance were still the currency of the realm. They were wrong. The 1970s brought a new challenge: the rise of republicanism, not as a political movement, but as a cultural shrug. The Queen's Silver Jubilee in 1977 was designed to counter this, to remind the nation of the value of continuity and tradition. And for a brief, glorious moment, it worked. The country erupted in a wave of street parties, flag-waving, and genuine affection. The Queen, now in her 50s, traveled the length and breadth of the United Kingdom, walking through streets festooned with bunting, smiling at crowds that had turned out in their hundreds of thousands. It was a visceral reminder that, for all the social change, for all the cynicism of the intellectual, the monarchy still held a deep, emotional place in the hearts of many of her subjects. But even as the Jubilee celebrations unfolded, a shadow was lengthening. Prince Charles, now in his late 20s, was under immense pressure to marry. He was the heir to the throne, and the question of who would be his bride and the future queen was a matter of national obsession. The press pursued every woman he was seen with, speculating endlessly about his intentions. Charles, however, was in no hurry. He was in love with a woman named Camilla Shan, a lively, intelligent, and unconventional young woman who shared his love of country life and his irreverent sense of humor. But Camilla was not considered suitable royal bride material. She had a history, a past that included a long relationship with another man. More importantly, she did not fit the mold of a virgin princess. The palace, and the prince's beloved great-uncle Lord Mountbatten, gently steered him away from her. Camilla married her longtime suitor, Andrew Parker Bowles, in 1973. Charles was devastated, but he did what was expected of him. He moved on. The search for a suitable bride became a desperate, almost farcical exercise. Charles dated a series of eligible young women, but none of them seemed right. He was a complex, thoughtful man, and he needed a partner who could understand him, who could share his intellectual interests and his deep sense of isolation. Instead, the palace and the press were looking for a beautiful, biddable virgin, a blank slate upon which the nation could project its fantasies. They found her in Lady Diana Spencer. Diana was young, just 19 when she first came to public attention. She was beautiful in a shy, blushing way that the press found irresistible. She came from an aristocratic family with deep roots in royal history. Her grandmother had been a lady-in-waiting to the Queen Mother. On paper, she was perfect, but the reality was far more complicated. Diana was deeply insecure, the product of a painful divorce between her parents. She was emotionally needy, desperate for the love and attention she had never received as a child. She was also, beneath the shy demeanor, surprisingly strong-willed and intuitive. She sensed, even in those early days, that she was being chosen not for who she was, but for what she represented. Courtship was a bizarre, stilted affair. Charles, under intense pressure from his family and his advisors, proposed after a few brief meetings. Diana, swept up in the fairy tale, accepted. The engagement interview conducted on the lawns of Buckingham Palace was a masterpiece of unintentional revelation. When a reporter asked the couple if they were in love, Diana instantly, brightly replied, "Of course." Charles, standing beside her, turned and gave a different answer. "Whatever in love mean." It was a strange, awkward response, a flicker of honesty in a sea of manufactured sentiment. The nation chose to ignore it, blinded by the fairy tale. But the words hung in the air, a small, dark cloud on the horizon of the brightest of futures. The wedding, on July 29, 1981, was the largest televised event in history. A global audience of 750 million people watched as Lady Diana Spencer walked up the aisle of St. Paul's Cathedral, her 25-foot train flowing behind her like a river of silk. The dress, a confection of ivory taffeta and antique lace, was a symbol of purity and innocence. The groom, resplendent in his naval uniform, waited at the altar, his eyes fixed on his approaching bride. The Archbishop of Canterbury declared it the stuff of which fairy tales are made. And for a single, shimmering moment it was. The crowds roared, the bells pealed, and the world fell in love with the new Princess of Wales. The House of Windsor had acquired its most precious and most dangerous asset. The sun was rising on a new era, but no one yet knew that this particular sun would bring not just light, but a fire that would threaten to consume them all. The question, unasked in the euphoria of that July day, was simple. What happens when the fairy tale ends? Chapter 4: The War of the Waleses. The fairy tale did not end with a single dramatic event. It unraveled slowly like a thread pulled from an expensive garment, the damage invisible at first, then suddenly, catastrophically obvious. The first years of the marriage were a performance, a meticulously staged production for the camera. The world saw the shy glances, the matching outfits, the adorable baby boys, William in 1982, Harry in 1984. They saw a perfect family, the embodiment of royal continuity and domestic bliss. But behind the gilded doors of Kensington Palace, a very different reality was taking shape. We can feel the cold isolation of those early years through Diana's eyes. She was 19 when she became a princess, thrust into a world she did not understand, surrounded by courtiers who viewed her with suspicion, and married to a man who was still in love with another woman. The age gap between her and Charles was 12 years, but the emotional gap was a chasm. He retreated to his books, his paintings, his long letters to Camilla. She wandered the vast, silent apartments of Kensington Palace, lonely and confused, desperate for the affection he could not give. The eating disorders began early, bulimia, a secret struggle with food that became a way of asserting control in a life where she had none. The self-harm followed, small, private acts of pain that were never meant to be seen. She was drowning, and no one around her seemed to notice. Or if they did, they chose to look away. Charles, for his part, was equally trapped. He had done his duty, married the chosen bride, produced the required heirs. But he was deeply unhappy. He missed Camilla with an ache that never subsided. He found Diana's emotional volatility exhausting and confusing. He had been raised to suppress his feelings, to maintain a stiff upper lip. She wore her heart on her sleeve, a raw, bleeding wound that demanded attention. They were fundamentally incompatible, two people from different emotional planets, forced to share a cramped and airless space. The arguments became more frequent, more vicious. The silences between them grew longer, colder. The palace staff learned to navigate the minefield of their moods, tiptoeing around the simmering tension. The press, initially complicit in the fairy tale, began to sense a different story. The tabloids, always hungry for a royal scoop, started to pick up on the cracks. There were whispers of late-night phone calls, of a certain Mrs. Parker Bowles, of a marriage in trouble. The palace's response was the old one: silence, denial, a hope that the storm would pass. But the storm was not passing. It was gathering strength, feeding on the very silence that was meant to contain it. The 1980s were a decade of greed, ambition, and media circus. And the royal family, despite all its efforts, was becoming the main attraction. The turning point came in the late 1980s, and it came from an unexpected source: the monarchy itself. The Queen, ever conscious of the need to modernize, had agreed to cooperate with a documentary series about the royal family. The result, Royal Family in 1969, had been a huge success, humanizing the Windsors for a new generation. But a follow-up, conceived in the late 80s and titled Elizabeth R., was a very different proposition. The cameras were allowed unprecedented access to the private lives of the family, including the Waleses. What they captured was not a happy family, but a deeply dysfunctional one. The footage of Charles and Diana, shown to the Queen and her advisors, was so revealing, so uncomfortable, that the project was shelved. But the damage was done. The truth was out there, captured on film, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. And explode it did, not through a documentary but through a book. In 1992, Andrew Morton published Diana, Her True Story. It was a bombshell. The book, based on tapes secretly recorded by Diana herself and passed to Morton through a trusted intermediary, revealed the full extent of her misery: the bulimia, the suicide attempts, the isolation, and most devastatingly, the existence of Camilla Parker Bowles. The book painted Charles as a cold, uncaring husband, obsessed with his mistress, indifferent to his wife's suffering. The public was stunned. The fairy tale was not just cracked, it was shattered into a million pieces. The press, which had built Diana up, now turned on Charles with a vengeance. He was portrayed as a villain, a betrayer of the nation's sweetheart. The Queen watched this unfolding disaster with a mixture of horror and helplessness. Her beloved institution, the family firm she had dedicated her life to preserving, was tearing itself apart in public. The tabloids were in a frenzy, and there was no off switch. The old rules of silence and dignity were useless against this new reality. The family, so carefully managed for so long, was now a soap opera, and the world was hooked. The Queen's own annus horribilis, as she would later call it, was just beginning. In 1992, not only did the Wales marriage implode in public, but Windsor Castle, the ancestral home, caught fire, suffering extensive damage. The image of the castle in flames, broadcast around the world, was a perfect metaphor for the state of the monarchy itself. It was burning, and no one seemed able to put out the fire. The separation of Charles and Diana was announced in December 1992. It was a formal acknowledgement of a reality that had been obvious for years. But the separation did not end the war. it merely changed the battlefield. The press now had two camps to cover: the Prince of Wales, retreating into his charitable work and his relationship with Camilla, and the Princess of Wales, emerging as a global icon in her own right. Diana's star, far from dimming after the separation, burned brighter than ever. She shed the frumpy, shy image of the early years and transformed herself into a fashion icon, a humanitarian, a woman of power and purpose. Her campaign against landmines, her work with AIDS patients, her ability to connect with the most marginalized people, all of this was captured on camera and beamed around the world. She was the People's Princess, a title that implicitly contrasted her warmth and accessibility with the cold formality of the palace. The war was now fought in the pages of newspapers, in carefully staged photo opportunities, and in the courts of public opinion. Charles, advised by a new, more aggressive team of Chinese letter consultants, fought back. He cooperated with his own biographer, Jonathan Dimbleby, who produced a book and a television documentary that presented the prince's side of the story. Charles admitted to his adultery with Camilla, but only after his marriage had irretrievably broken down. He spoke of his difficult childhood, his lonely existence, his sense of duty. But the public was not in a forgiving mood. The image of the cold, privileged prince, complaining about his difficult life while the nation's sweetheart suffered, did not play well. The Dimbleby project backfired, cementing Charles's reputation as the villain of the piece. The royal family, meanwhile, was caught in the crossfire. The Queen, ever stoic, tried to maintain a dignified silence, but the silence was interpreted as coldness, as indifference to Diana's suffering. Prince Philip, Charles's father, was rumored to have written harsh letters to Diana, demanding she change her behavior. The Queen Mother, the beloved matriarch, was seen as part of the old guard, the establishment that had failed Diana. The family was losing the PR war, and they knew it. The 1990s were a decade of relentless, grinding negativity for the House of Windsor. Every headline, every photograph, every leaked story seemed to chip away at the foundations of the institution. Diana, in contrast, was ascendant. She had found her voice, her purpose, her power. She was no longer the victim, she was a force. Her visit to Angola in 1997, walking through a minefield in a protective visor and flak jacket, was a masterstroke of modern celebrity activism. It put a human face on a complex issue and shamed governments into action. The image of her, fragile yet fearless, walking through that dusty field was unforgettable. She was using her platform for good, and the world loved her for it. The palace watched with a mixture of admiration and alarm. She was outshining them all, and there was nothing they could do about it. By the summer of 1997, the war had reached a kind of uneasy stalemate. Diana had moved on, embracing her role as a global humanitarian, and reportedly exploring a new relationship with WWII, the son of an Egyptian billionaire. Charles was slowly, quietly, trying to rehabilitate his image and introduce Camilla to a skeptical public. The Queen and the rest of the family retreated to their Scottish estate at Balmoral, seeking the comfort of tradition and the solitude of the Highland. The world, for a brief moment, seemed to hold its breath. And then, in the early hours of August 31, 1997, the world stopped. The news came in fragments, then in a devastating whole. A car crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel in Paris. WWII dead at the scene. Diana, trapped in the wreckage, rushed to a hospital. And then the confirmation that no one wanted to hear. The Princess of Wales was dead. The sensory experience of that morning is etched into the collective memory. The flicker of television screens in empty kitchens, the stunned silence of radio announcers, the first tears shed by strangers on the street. A woman who had been the most photographed, most talked about, most beloved figure on the planet was gone, snatched away in an instant of metal and glass. The House of Windsor was not just shaken, it was paralyzed. The family was at Balmoral, isolated in their grief and, crucially, isolated from the national mood. The Queen's first instinct, drilled into her over a lifetime of duty, was to protect her grandsons, William and Harry, from the media storm. She kept them at Balmoral, away from the cameras, away from the frenzy. It was a mother's instinct, a grandmother's love. But in the vacuum of the palace's silence, a terrible anger began to build. The people wanted to mourn their princess. They wanted to see their queen, to hear from their queen, to feel that their grief was shared. And for day after day, the Queen remained silent at Balmoral. The flags above Buckingham Palace flew at half-mast, but the Queen was not there. The crowds gathered, laying mountains of flowers, weeping openly, and the silence from the palace grew louder, more unforgivable with each passing hour. The monarchy, which had survived wars and abdications, now faced its greatest threat, the perception that it did not care. The pressure became unbearable. The tabloids, which had spent years feasting on the royal family's dysfunction, now turned on them with a unified, righteous fury. "Show us you care," screamed one headline. "Your people are suffering," cried another. The Queen's advisers, led by the newly appointed press secretary, Simon Lewis, watched the polls with growing alarm. The monarchy's approval ratings were plummeting. There was talk, serious talk, of republicanism gaining traction. The unthinkable was becoming thinkable. If the Queen did not respond and respond quickly, the House of Windsor could fall. Finally, on the Friday before the funeral, the Queen returned to London. She walked among the crowds outside Buckingham Palace, looking at the sea of flowers, the messages of love and loss. She was not smiling. She looked small, pale, and deeply moved. That evening, she addressed the nation in a live television broadcast. It was a moment of profound vulnerability, a rare breach in the wall of royal reserve. She spoke not as a queen, but as a grandmother. "No one who knew Diana will ever forget her," she said, her voice steady but soft. "I for one believe there are lessons to be drawn from her life and from the extraordinary and moving reaction to her death." And then the line that mattered most: "I share in your grief." It was a simple statement, but it was enough. It was the human connection that the people had been desperate for. The anger began to subside, replaced by a grudging respect for a woman who had finally, publicly, shown her heart. The funeral on September 6, 1997, was an event without precedent. The coffin, draped in the royal standard, was borne through the streets of London on a gun carriage, followed by a procession of mourners that included Prince Charles, Prince Philip, and Diana's brother, Earl Spencer. But walking behind the coffin in a decision that shocked the world were two young boys, Prince William, aged 15, and Prince Harry, aged 12. Their faces, pale and stricken, were visible to the millions watching. It was an image of devastating, raw grief, a private pain made unbearably public. The sensory memory of that day is overwhelming. The muffled drums, the clip of hooves, the sobs from the crowd, the sea of white flowers thrown at the hearse, the terrible, beautiful silence as the coffin passed. Elton John's rewritten version of "Candle in the Wind" filled the air, its lyrics a direct address to England's rose. Inside Westminster Abbey, Earl Spencer delivered a eulogy that was both a loving tribute to his sister and a thinly veiled attack on the royal family. He spoke of a woman of innate nobility who was hunted by the press, and he promised that her blood would be in the veins of her sons, the future kings. He looked directly at the royal family as he spoke, the tension in the ancient stone walls thick enough to cut. It was a public reckoning, a moment when the family's failures were laid bare for the world to see. The Queen sat immobile, her face a mask, but the words must have cut deep. The War of the Waleses was over. Diana had won. But the cost of that victory was her life, and the House of Windsor was left to pick up the pieces, to look at the two young boys who now carried her legacy, and to ask itself a question that had no easy answer. How do you rebuild a family when its most beloved member has become its most powerful ghost? The future of the monarchy now rested not on the shoulders of a queen, but on the hearts of two grieving children. Chapter 5. The Firm in the Age of Fracture. The years immediately following Diana's death were a long, slow exhale. The nation and the royal family seemed to move in a state of collective mourning, the grief too raw, too recent to be processed. For the young princes, William and Harry, the loss was a permanent shadow, a hole in the universe that could never be filled. They returned to school, to the semblance of normal life, but nothing was normal. They were the most famous motherless children in the world. Their every gesture, every expression, photographed and analyzed. The House of Windsor, so often portrayed as a cold and unfeeling institution, had to find a way to raise these boys, to heal them, to prepare them for the futures they could not escape. The Queen, in her own quiet way, began the work of repair. The annus horribilis had taught her a painful lesson. The old ways, the silence and the distance, were no longer viable. She had to be seen, not just as a monarch, but as a grandmother. She spent more time with William and Harry, inviting them to Balmoral, to Sandringham, to the private spaces where the cameras could not reach. She walked with them in the hills, taught them to fish. shared the simple pleasures of country life that had always been her own refuge. It was not a replacement for their mother. Nothing could be that. But it was a foundation, a sense of stability and continuity in a world that had been violently disrupted. Prince Charles, too, underwent a transformation. The man who had been vilified as a cold, uncaring husband emerged as a devoted, if unconventional, father. He had always been closer to his boys than the public realized, sharing his love of art, music, and the outdoors. Now he became their primary protector, shielding them from the worst of the media frenzy, guiding them through the treacherous waters of adolescence and grief. He also, slowly and painstakingly, began the process of rehabilitating Camilla Parker Bowles in the public eye. It was a delicate operation, a campaign of small, incremental steps. A photograph here, a carefully worded statement there. The public, still fiercely protective of Diana's memory, was not ready to forgive the woman they saw as the other woman. But Charles was patient. He had waited decades for Camilla. He could wait a few more years. The new millennium brought a cautious optimism. The Queen's Golden Jubilee in 2002 was a deliberate echo of her father's Silver Jubilee, a moment of national celebration designed to reaffirm the bond between crown and country. But the year was also marked by loss. The Queen Mother, the beloved matriarch who had embodied the spirit of the wartime generation, died at the age of 101, just weeks after the death of the Queen's younger sister, Princess Margaret. It was a double blow, a reminder of mortality and the passing of an era. The Queen, now in her 70s, stood alone at the funeral of her mother, a solitary figure in black, the weight of a lifetime of duty etched into her face. But she stood as she always had. That was her gift, simply being there, an unshakable presence in a changing world. The marriage of Charles and Camilla, finally, officially, took place in 2005. It was not a state occasion, but a civil ceremony followed by a service of blessing. The public, after years of careful management, had largely accepted Camilla. She would not be queen. She would be known as the Duchess of Cornwall, a subtle but significant distinction. The couple settled into a quiet, comfortable life at Highgrove and Clarence House, a world away from the tabloid frenzy of the 1990s. The war was over. The peace, fragile and hard-won, had begun. The next generation was now coming of age, and with them, a new hope for the House of Windsor. Prince William, the elder son, was everything the institution could have hoped for. He had his mother's charisma and his father's sense of duty, tempered by a modern, easygoing manner that made him instantly relatable. He was handsome, charming, and clearly dedicated to his role. He trained at Sandhurst, served as a search and rescue pilot, and threw himself into charitable work, particularly around mental health, a cause deeply connected to his own experiences of grief. He was, in the eyes of the public, the future, a king who would be both traditional and modern, a bridge between the old world and the new. And then there was Kate. Catherine Middleton was not an aristocrat. She was the daughter of self-made millionaires who had built a successful party supply business. She was a commoner in the truest sense, a woman from Berkshire who had met William at the University of St. Andrews. Her arrival on the scene was a cultural earthquake. Here was a future queen who had grown up in a normal house, who had flown on budget airline, who seemed, in every way, an ordinary young woman. The press, initially skeptical, dubbed her Weighty Katie as the courtship dragged on. But when the engagement was finally announced in 2010, the reaction was one of overwhelming joy. The fairy tale was back, but this time, it was a different kind of fairy tale, not a princess plucked from obscurity, but a modern woman choosing to marry into an ancient institution on her own terms. The wedding on April 29, 2011 was a global spectacle that rivaled the wedding of Charles and Diana 30 years earlier, but the atmosphere was entirely different. This was not a nervous, shy bride. This was a confident, radiant woman walking up the aisle of Westminster Abbey. This was not a groom haunted by the ghost of a former lover. This was a man deeply, obviously in love. The Queen, now 85, sat in the Abbey and watched her grandson marry. The contrast with the past was striking. This was a wedding of hope, not of desperation. It was a signal that the House of Windsor, after decades of turmoil, had finally found its footing. The crowds roared, the bells pealed, and the world smiled. A new chapter had begun. The years that followed were a period of relative calm and stability. William and Kate produced heirs, Prince George in 2013, Princess Charlotte in 2015, Prince Louis in 2018, ensuring the line of succession for generations to come. They became the face of the modern monarchy, a glamorous, relatable, and deeply popular couple. The Queen, now in her 90s, began to slow down, gracefully handing over more and more responsibilities to the next generation. The Diamond Jubilee in 2012 was another triumph, a celebration of 60 years on the throne that saw the Queen travel the length of the Thames on a royal barge, surrounded by a flotilla of 1,000 boats. It was a moment of pure, unalloyed pageantry, a reminder of the enduring power of tradition. The House of Windsor, it seemed, had weathered every storm. It was stable, popular, and looking towards a bright future. But even in this golden afternoon, shadows were gathering. Prince Harry, the younger son, was struggling. He had always been the spare, the mischievous, fun-loving counterpart to his more serious brother. But beneath the surface, he was carrying deep wounds. He later revealed that he had suffered panic attacks and severe anxiety for years, struggling to process the trauma of his mother's death. The pressure of royal life, the constant scrutiny, the sense of being trapped in a role he had not chosen, it was all taking a toll. He partied, he drank, he made headlines for the wrong reasons. He was the wild child, the one the palace could never quite control. And then he met Meghan. Meghan Markle was unlike anyone who had ever entered the royal family. She was an American, a divorced actress, a woman of mixed race who had built a successful career on her own terms. She was confident, outspoken, and fiercely independent. When her relationship with Harry was confirmed in 2016, it was a sensation. Here was a prince, the ultimate symbol of British tradition, falling in love with a modern, biracial, feminist American. The fairy tale was rewritten for a new, more diverse generation. The wedding in May 2018 was a stunning, joyful celebration, a fusion of tradition and modernity that seemed to herald a new era for the monarchy. The sermon, delivered by Bishop Michael Curry, spoke of the power of love with a fiery, evangelical passion that had never been heard within the ancient walls of Windsor Castle. The world watched, captivated. The House of Windsor was not just surviving, it was evolving. But the fairy tale once again began to unravel. From the beginning, Meghan was subjected to a level of media scrutiny that was both relentless and at times viciously racist. The tabloids seized on every detail of her life, every perceived slight, every family feud. She was too American, too Hollywood, too outspoken. She was accused of being difficult, of bullying staff, of driving a wedge between Harry and his family. The contrast with Kate, the beloved, safe, traditional princess, was constantly invoked. Kate was good, Meghan was bad. The narrative was set and it was toxic. Harry, watching his wife suffer the same media onslaught that had destroyed his mother, was determined not to let history repeat itself. He fought back, issuing rare statements denouncing the press and defending Meghan. But the palace, cautious and institutional, was slow to react. The old machinery of royal protection, designed for a different age, was useless against the new, digitized, globalized media ecosystem. Harry and Meghan felt isolated, unsupported, trapped. The dream of a modern, inclusive monarchy was turning into a nightmare of negative headlines and family tension. The cracks widened. Rumors of a rift between William and Harry, once unthinkable, became a constant topic of speculation. The Fab Four, as the press had dubbed the two couples, was clearly not so fab. In October 2019, Harry and Meghan released a statement confirming they were taking a step back from royal life. The world was stunned, but the full shock was yet to come. In a bombshell interview with Oprah Winfrey in March 2021, the couple laid bare their grievances. They spoke of racism within the family, of a lack of support from the institution, of Meghan's struggles with mental health and suicidal thoughts. They revealed that there had been concerns and conversations about how dark their unborn son's skin might be. The interview was a devastating indictment of the House of Windsor, a public reckoning that echoed the trauma of the Diana years. The family was once again at war with itself, and this time the battle was being fought on a global stage, in full color, with no filter. The Queen's response was measured, careful, and characteristically understated. The whole family is saddened to learn the full extent of how challenging the last few years have been for Harry and Meghan, the palace statement read. The issues raised, particularly that of race, are concerning. While some recollections may vary, they are taken very seriously and will be addressed by the family privately. It was an attempt to de-escalate, to contain the damage, to return to the old principle of silence and privacy. But the damage was already done. The interview had been watched by nearly 50 million people worldwide. The image of the royal family as a happy, functional unit was shattered, replaced by a picture of a cold institution that had failed its own. The departure of Harry and Meghan was more than a family rift. It was a structural crisis. They had been two of the most high-profile, popular members of the family, particularly with younger and more diverse audiences. Their loss was a blow to the monarchy's efforts to modernize and stay relevant. The Sussex problem, as it became known, was a constant, low-level hum of negative publicity. Every interview, every podcast, every Netflix documentary seemed to peel back another layer of the royal facade, revealing the human drama beneath. The House of Windsor, built on the principle of never complain, never explain, was now living in an age of radical transparency, where its most aggrieved members could speak directly to the world, unfiltered and unmediated. Yet through it all, one figure remained constant: the Queen. Elizabeth II, now in her 90s, continued to perform her duties with unwavering dedication. She received prime ministers, opened parliaments, undertook engagements, a small, immaculate figure in bright colors, a beacon of continuity in a fractured world. She had seen it all: war and peace, abdication and jubilee, triumph and tragedy. She had outlasted every critic, every scandal, every prediction of the monarchy's demise. She was, in the words of one biographer, the last monarch who remembers the empire, a living link to a vanished world. Her presence was the glue that held the institution together. In the spring of 2021, she lost her husband of 73 years. Prince Philip, the man who had been her strength and stay since her accession, died at Windsor Castle just weeks before his 100th birthday. The image of the Queen, sitting alone in St. George's Chapel at his funeral, masked and socially distanced, was one of the most poignant of her entire reign. It was a portrait of grief, of solitude, of the end of an era. She was no longer just the Queen. She was a widow, an old woman saying goodbye to her lifelong companion. The nation, which had watched her navigate a lifetime of public duty, now saw her in a moment of private, universal pain. It was a reminder that beneath the crown, beneath the institution, there was always a human heart. The final year of her life was a slow, graceful diminuendo. She retreated more and more to Windsor Castle, the fortress her grandfather had chosen as the family's new name, conducting audiences by video link, receiving visitors in her private apartments. The Platinum Jubilee in the summer of 2022 was a celebration of her 70 years on the throne, an outpouring of love and gratitude that surprised even her. She appeared on the balcony of Buckingham Palace, a frail but unmistakable figure waving to the crowds one last time. The pageantry, the parades, the concerts, it was all for her, a final, glorious tribute to a life of service. But those close to her knew the end was near. She was tired. She was ready. On September 8, 2022, the announcement came from Balmoral. The doctors were concerned. The family rushed to her side, and at 3:10 in the afternoon, the longest reigning monarch in British history passed away peacefully, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. The news broke across the world like a wave. The Queen was dead. The second Elizabethan age was over. The days that followed were a ritual of mourning unlike anything the world had seen since the death of Diana. But this was different. This was not the shocking, violent loss of a young woman. It was the gentle, inevitable passing of a beloved grandmother. The queue, the miles-long line of mourners snaking through London to file past her coffin in Westminster Hall, was a spontaneous, breathtaking expression of collective grief. People waited for hours, for days, in the cold and the rain, just to spend a few seconds in the presence of their queen. They came from every corner of the kingdom, from every walk of life. They brought flowers, wrote messages, wept openly. It was a sensory experience of profound emotional power. The silence of the hall, broken only by the shuffle of feet and the occasional sob, the smell of flowers and incense, the sight of the coffin, draped in the royal standard, the imperial state crown resting on top, its jewels catching the light. It was a farewell to a monarch, but it was also a farewell to an era, a way of life, a sense of stability that had seemed as permanent as the stones of the abbey itself. The funeral at Westminster Abbey was a state occasion of unparalleled grandeur. World leaders, royalty, and dignitaries gathered to pay their respects. The service was a masterwork of ancient ritual and modern sensibility, a reflection of the woman it honored. And as the coffin was borne from the abbey, the lonely piper's lament fading into the London air, the reign of Elizabeth II was over. The crown passed in an instant to her son. Charles, the Prince of Wales for longer than any in history, was now king. The man who had waited a lifetime, who had been shaped and scarred by the dramas of his family, who had loved and lost and loved again, now carried the weight of the crown. The question that had hung in the air for decades was finally answered. What kind of king would he be? The reign of Charles III began in the shadow of his mother's death, but also in the light of a new dawn. The accession was seamless, the transition smooth. The machinery of monarchy, perfected over 1,000 years, turned without a hitch. But the challenges facing the new king were immense. He inherited a kingdom fractured by Brexit, by political turmoil, by questions of national identity. He inherited a commonwealth that was questioning its relevance and its relationship to the British crown. And he inherited a family still healing from the wounds of the Sussex exit. A family navigating the treacherous waters of the modern media landscape. Charles, however, was not the man he had been in the 1990s. The years had softened him, given him perspective. His marriage to Camilla, now his queen consort, had brought him a peace and stability he had never known. He had grown into his role as a grandfather, finding joy in the next generation. He had spent a lifetime preparing for this moment, studying the issues, meeting the people, building the foundations of his kingship. He was determined to be a different kind of monarch, a king of all the people. As he declared in his first address to the nation, he spoke of his mother's legacy, of his love for his sons, of his commitment to service. It was a speech of humility and hope, a promise to carry forward the work of a lifetime while forging his own path. The coronation on May 6, 2023 was a scaled-down, modernized version of the ancient ritual. It was shorter, more inclusive, reflective of a changed Britain. But at its heart, it was the same ceremony that had crowned his mother 70 years earlier, the same oaths, the same anointing, the same crowning. As the Archbishop of Canterbury placed St. Edward's crown upon his head and the trumpets sounded, a new chapter of the House of Windsor began. The crowds outside Buckingham Palace, smaller than those for his mother's funeral, cheered. The new king and queen appeared on the balcony, waving to the nation. The future, uncertain and complex, stretched out before them. The challenges are not going away. The question of relevance, of purpose, of connection to a young, diverse, and increasingly skeptical population remain. The ghost of Diana still hovers, a reminder of the human cost of the institution. The shadow of Harry and Meghan from their home in California continues to fall across the family, a constant, unresolved tension. William and Kate, now the Prince and Princess of Wales, carry the hopes of the future on their shoulders. Their children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, represent the next link in the chain, the continuation of a story that began in the smoke and fire of 1917. The House of Windsor has endured for over a century. It has survived world wars, abdication, divorce, scandal, and death. It has adapted, rebranded, and reinvented itself, time and again. It has learned that survival requires not just tradition, but evolution. Not just duty, but humanity. The name, chosen in desperation 100 years ago, has become synonymous with the very idea of monarchy itself. It is a fortress, yes, but it is also a family with all the love, loss, and complexity that entails. The story is not over. It never is. The queue has dispersed, the mourners have gone home, but the journey continues. The question now is not whether the House of Windsor will survive, but what it will become. And that answer lies not in the past, but in the hands of the children waving from the balcony, the next generation of Windsors, the inheritors of a legacy written in fire and crowned with hope.